So we're going to start then with our second workshop. My name is Dr. Sadlier. This one is about developing critical thinking skills. So the first one was more just about the nuts and bolts of academic writing. But in this one, we're going to be thinking about how do we think? In what ways do we think? How can we think in a more critical manner? So that's essentially the topic of this second workshop. There are a few learning outcomes, so the things we want you to hopefully have learned by the end of the workshop. Firstly, to examine our reading practices and to think about how these can be improved to maximize learning. Secondly, to define critical thinking and its importance within academic writing. And thirdly, to examine a notable case study from the peer-reviewed literature, as well as responses to the case study to highlight the importance of critical thinking skills. So hopefully you've managed prior to this workshop to read through the two article case studies that were this, as well as some of the responses to it. That's going to be the basis for a little bit of a discussion later on. Feel free to write any comments or questions you have into the chat box, and I'll get to them hopefully a bit later as we go along in this presentation. Okay.
I don't know whether we have shared the slide deck. I don't think I have received it. I have received the material, but not the slide deck, I believe.
I think Carly, I sent over the slides, but the file was quite big. So she was sending it on to Luke, who does production, to make the file size smaller. So that if it's not out to you already, it should be today or tomorrow, I think. And it'll be cool. the same with this. It'll be sent out afterwards. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
No problem. Okay, so reading practices. I think, Jing, you actually mentioned this topic in the first workshop as something that was of interest. So this section could be of particular interest to you. When you're reading something, there's kind of various questions, important questions you need to ask yourself. So because you're working on a thesis, a piece of research, what is required of this thesis? So what are the basic requirements as per the handbook for the program? Why am I reading this text? And what do I want to get out of it? So you have to have a motivation for reading a particular text. Maybe you know it's somewhere in the ballpark of the kind of topic or general theme of your thesis, but what is the particular reason you've chosen to read this text? And what do you hope to get out of it? And a very personal question, but very important question is, what is my concentration span? And how can I adapt my reading practices accordingly? And now this is only something you can figure out only for yourself, essentially, because everyone has very personal attention spans. Some people can, like, not that I would recommend it, but can sit down for 2 hours and read nonstop and take notes without any breaks, whereas someone else might only have an attention span of 20 minutes, and that's completely fine, but you need to figure out what way you work and what works for you, and to adapt your reading practices accordingly. So that's really, really important. How can I write more effective notes? So that's something we're going to talk about a little bit here, and hopefully you'll be able to practice it a bit later when we're going to look through the 2 articles in the case study to have a little bit of a discussion. Okay, so those are some broad topics that you need to consider when you're beginning to look at reading practices. Something also to consider is how to find relevant texts. Now this is really, really important as you embark on any research journey. So for instance, there are a few really important tools, like library databases are probably the most important and useful, trustworthy sites of information to find sources. And luckily you have a whole archive of relevant literature available to you through the University of Plymouth Library. So you can find multiple sources in there, all free of charge. So I would make the very most of that. On your TLP, I know there is a video that I created last summer. I would have a look at that, about how to search for relevant articles or pieces of literature for your research using key search terms or other tools. So I would urge you to have a look at that as well, so you get a better idea. Now, Google Scholar, it is useful, but it does not always have good quality sources listed. So you have to look at the sources listed on Google Scholar with a critical eye. And that is, of course, where critical evaluation and thinking skills come in, which we're going to discuss more in this brief presentation. I would say do not cite Wikipedia. Now, I'm not saying Wikipedia is not useful. It is actually very useful for getting an overview of a topic and finding some related sources. However, it should not be referenced as a scholarly source within your thesis in itself. So you can find many relevant sources that you can then go to and read and evaluate yourself from a Wikipedia entry, but I wouldn't take everything a Wikipedia entry says as gospel. Now, of course, Wikipedia entries generally, I think speaking, have got much better in quality, and in some cases are even written by top scholars these days, but you have to be very critical and look at it all with a critical eye, because you don't know for definite. So I would suggest using it as a reference source, but not referenced directly. You can find relevant sources from it. That would be my suggestion. Now, this is the really important topic that we mentioned last week, and I think would be of interest to you, Jing. Reading strategies. So how can we improve our methods of reading so that we get more out of a source and can be more critical in the way we write? So there are a number of ways of reading. So the first is skimming and scanning. So for instance, this is when you read the abstract and conclusions, so the key parts of most journal articles, and you have a quick look through the rest of the text to see if this is of use. The strategy can also be referred to as getting the gist of a topic. So you're getting a general idea of what it's about, kind of thinking to yourself, is this useful, is it not? So it's a really useful initial step to kind of filter out relevant sources or not. The other method then is critical reading. So this is kind of once you've identified, oh, the source might be relevant, then you read through the text. You can underline or highlight key parts, or for instance, you can also put post-it notes on relevant sections, depending on whatever way you prefer doing it, or you can use a combination of those methods. Then you write some brief notes to summarize these key points. So I capitalized here in your own words, because it's really important that you're paraphrasing, not basically writing down the text almost exactly as it was, but actually showing that you've understood it by writing it in your own words in a simple way. It doesn't have to be complicated. After this, you add a few sentences of critical reflection. For instance, why was this source useful and or limited? So these are the steps of critical reading, and hopefully we can apply this slightly later in this workshop, where we're going to look through the two articles and the responses to the articles to think about this kind of quite controversial topic that was discussed of colonialism. So those are the steps of critical reading. So you're reading through, underlining, highlighting, write some brief notes in your own words, and then add a few sentences of critical reflection. So really there are kind of 3 steps in critical reading, if you think of it that way. So hopefully that makes sense, but if you have any questions about that or how you go about critical reading, let me know in the chat box, but we can hopefully apply it a bit later anyway.
Sure. I just wonder, you mentioned that you have created a video for how to search in the Primo. Did you mind to share the link? I'm completely new to here.
Yeah, it's it should be in the TLP somewhere under the study skills part.
Okay.
But
Okay.
if it isn't, I can ask Luke where it is directly, and hopefully can send on a link directly to it. So in case
Okay.
you can't find it, yeah.
Sure,
But,
I'll try. Thank you.
yeah, it should be there somewhere though. I think it's on all of them, all of the research masters or whatever. So it should be there. But anyway, I can ask. Okay, that's reading strategies then. Hopefully you understand what critical reading is as compared to just skimming scanning, which is very different. It's kind of more an initial stage. But a key message then, I think I should mention that it's quite important, is do not keep reading forever. Now, I'm guilty of this sometimes too. You get into a topic, you're like, oh, this article is interesting. Oh, that one's interesting. But the point of a thesis is that you follow a line of argumentation on your topic and reach a conclusion eventually. Is not just about regurgitating the opinions of others, hence the importance of critical evaluation skills. So there is a point you have to say, right, I got to stop now and I need to think about what I think about this, not what him, her, X, Y, what they think of it. So that's really important. You have to stop at a certain point. And I would encourage everyone to write sooner rather than later, not just to write notes forever, but to actually start writing your own text sooner rather than later. I guess that's why we have the various stages of the research thesis, where you do your abstract, your peer review, then your project proposal, and then you do, you know, the main thing, so that at least it's keeping you on track and making sure you're writing some things, essentially. A useful exercise is, can you summarize the key argument or idea of your thesis in, say, 1 to 3 sentences? If you can, then you're on the right track. So it's almost like there's this thing called Pecha Kucha, which is like you basically do a really, really condensed you know, explanation of what a thesis or idea is in, I think it's like 3 slides, 3 minutes or something like that. It's basically like that idea. If you can do that and do it with ease, then you're on track and you know what you're discussing, what your core idea is, and then everything else will flow from that. But if you have just a string of literature described, a small bit of analysis, but you have no core line of thought running through the thing, then it's not really a thesis, essentially. So it's important to have a strong argument message, and yeah, as I said, not to research and keep reading and taking notes forever. At some stage, you need to begin collating it all. Okay, so that's a key message. Now it's important to ask, what is critical thinking? Because I've mentioned it a few times now, critical evaluation, critical thinking, but I think often we don't even really know what this thing is. It's a phrase kind of bandied around, and, you know, it just becomes a hackneyed phrase in the end, and often people don't know what they're actually talking about when they say critical thinking. So there are a few ways of understanding it quite simply. Broadly, there are 2 levels of engagement with a text, so description and analysis. One of the pitfalls of academic writing is engaging too much with the level of description. I have to highlight this because there's a big difference between just like describing an object, whatever it is, and then actually evaluating, say, how the different colors or the different textures work together. That's just a very simple, stupid example of, you know, what's the difference between description and analysis. You can say, oh, the colors are red, blue, and orange, but then you can say these colors work well together because that's where the critical thought comes in. Very simple, stupid example, but that's sort of what I mean. As researchers, we must also evaluate a source's biases, strengths, and limitations, and we should assess how our research fills a lacuna in the existing literature. So we're constantly seeing what the flaws in the existing literature are, and that's where it opens up the gap for where our research fits in. And we're like, this word lacuna means like kind of just a basic gap in existing knowledge that you're trying to fill, or that your thesis fills. And it's that gap you need to get to. What is the gap, essentially? Critical thinking engages with the but why and the so what questions. They're very kind of nagging sort of questions. So they're critical questions. You're asking, but why is it that way? You know, and so what? Like, what difference does that make? That kind of attitude essentially is a critical attitude. And we should probably apply it to many more things these days than we do, especially in the era of fake news. But this involves a constant process of questioning. Now, if you were to think of it in a kind of funny image, you think of a child nagging its mother about something that seems really commonplace, but why do the wheels of the bus go round and round? It's sort of like a child's questioning is essentially what critical thinking is. You need to reach that inner child that's questioning everything right from the get-go. So that is how I would explain critical thinking in very basic terms. It embraces complexity, so no knowledge claims are ever complete. No matter how solid a piece of work is that a scholar has done, how many references they have like included, how many hours they've spent, critiquing this X, Y, and Z. There are always gaps in any piece of research, and that's how research is built up, because no knowledge claim is ever complete, essentially. Now, Ennis sums up critical thinking quite well, actually, these 2 points. So the ability to reflect skeptically and the ability to think in a logical way. So it's that skepticism I've just highlighted in the previous slide, but why? Or so what? That skepticism. And the ability to think logically means that there's a coherent narrative running through the whole thesis, through every paragraph. And that's how logic builds up. It's not just a string of descriptions. That's not logic. Needs to build on sequentially. Every paragraph builds on another and builds up an argument. Now, this is Bloom's taxonomy, which you may be familiar with. It's kind of often used as a model for thinking of critical thinking skills. So basically, often, I think we focus too much on the bottom layers here, which are basically regurgitating information. So remember, understand, apply. And then we often forget about the top layers, which are the more critical layers, analyzing, evaluating, and ultimately creating new knowledge. So we need to focus a bit more on the top layers. And in most traditional education programs worldwide, really, unfortunately, it is an issue that often the bottom rungs are focused on more. It's about doing well in exams and assessments, but that's not real learning, really. So it's like really critical thinking skills should be built into all learning right from the time you're 6 years old, or whenever you start learning, 4 years old, whatever it is. Really, it should be. But yes, it's not always that way, unfortunately. So it's like, how do we reach those upper levels? And that's where critical thinking comes in. So Bloom's taxonomy features 3 domains.
So sorry, before you move on, I just got interested because I have a teenage boy as well,
Oh, yeah?
I just found that, when you have a discussion with him, when he running a problem, let's just say a mathematical problem, you explain to him, he said, oh, I get it. And then he walk away, but then come back from the conversation, clearly, they are not. So how did you deal with it? Because I can see this tree is really good, or, this kind of pyramid, but it's just, I don't know, is there any way I can apply, trying to help my son, because I think next year he's going to year 10 now, right?
Yes.
So he really needs to understand it and then he can apply it, right? But I just found out, I don't know whether it's just a different level or probably they're going to learn as they grow.
Yeah, I think it's like, it basically is almost like going back to being a child, when you just like question things that were just like, why is it that way? So it's like constantly asking critical questions, or encouraging like students or whoever it is you're talking to think in that way more. It's like the skepticism, to have that constant skepticism rather than just see kind of easy answers. And that's essentially where critical thinking comes in. And it is something, that just, it can be developed basically over time if you like keep, analyzing those critical questions. So I would just keep encouraging you to get your son to think of those questions constantly.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So Bloom's taxonomy then features 3 domains. These are cognitive, affective, and sensory. So we're focusing on the cognitive dimension on that previous diagram. So the bottom 2 rungs, which are remembering and understanding, are often emphasized in traditional education approaches. However, we need to develop the other aspects for deeper understanding. So application, analysis, evaluation, and creation. They're the ones we need to be aiming for. So this question now, is a source always valid? Now, website sources, these can be used sparingly, but always think whether they are, number 1, relevant to your topic, number 2, being funded by a company with a particular ethos, number 3, are biased or subject to a conflict of interest. Now, that is really something really important to consider. Website source, like web sources can be useful, but you need to kind of keep these ideas in your mind when you're looking through and to really reflect on those things. Because there can be subjects.
I just found there's all sorts of information, on the websites.
Yes.
For child, it's very hard, and also YouTube as well. People can make up in the video, make it look so real,
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so you have to be so aware these days. There could be any kind of bias, or anyone could be saying whatever they want essentially, and there's kind of this free sort of media where you can basically say what you want sometimes. But when we think of social media, we've been part of the biggest basically social experiment probably in the history of humanity over the last 20 years, but completely without question. It's only now they're starting to research effects of social media, for instance, on human brains. And so, and that's, anything could be basically written on social media, except for, certain things are then taken down. But, lots of things is put up there like that, it's not gone through a peer review, that's for sure, in a way. Which brings me to peer-reviewed journal articles. So these are seemingly the gold standard, as they need to go through a double-blind peer review where the researcher's work is heavily critiqued. However, sometimes journals can have vested interests and poisoned fish can slip through the net, to use the analogy.
Sorry, what did you mean double-blind peer review? You mean people wouldn't know your name and then you give it to different people, they wouldn't know you, so they just review as someone sings from the third party to make sure?
Yeah, it's anonymous. So you send in an article to a journal or whatever, and go through peer review. Your title page is separate from, almost always, is separate from your article or whatever you've written. Which then is reviewed critically without them knowing who you are, and you don't know who they are either. So that way, you're getting a fair, hopefully most of the time, fair critique of what you're doing. And that's really important, of course, because, you don't want any bias. If they're biased against you in some way, if you're biased against them in some way, then it's never going to work. So that's the way it generally works. Which brings me now to the critical thinking exercise. So hopefully you've had a chance to look through these 2 articles. I know it might have been a bit of work, but the aim was to really get you thinking about critical thinking on a slightly controversial topic. And it was a particularly, notable example, shall I say, within the literature. So what are the key issues with Gilly's article, if any?
I just quickly actually went through it, so just before the call.
Yeah, that's fine. No worries. We have time anyway because it's only 10:30 now. So here, so at least 5 minutes, probably closer to 10 minutes to look through it all.
Okay.
And you can use the critical notes taking that I mentioned earlier. So maybe, highlighting, underlining certain parts, writing in your own words what the things were about, and then writing a few critiques of each one, and then we can discuss. That's what I would recommend. We have a bit of time now, probably 10 minutes or so. So these are the questions that you need to consider.
Okay.
So key issues with Gillies' article. Do you agree with Rodriguez's critique? If so, why? So that's the critical question. If so, why? What does Gillies' article, which passed peer review, I may add, reveal to us about the importance of viewing all academic literature with a critical eye? And what do the multifaceted responses to Gillies' article reveal about the state of knowledge? So those are kind of 4 questions to consider as you look through. Now we have time, so I'm probably going to leave you up to 10 minutes before we discuss, and then I have a few more slides to basically cap off the workshop. And feel free to write any comments or anything as you go along, and we'll discuss in about 10 minutes or so. Okay?
Okay, sure.
Great.
Thanks.
Hello, Alamide. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, we're just working on an abstract exercise at the moment. So hopefully you manage to look through the abstracts because we're going to be talking about them in a few minutes. Fingers crossed. Okay. So if you can mute, yeah, mute. We're going to discuss in a couple of minutes, so just a couple more minutes to take some critical notes, and then we will discuss. Okay, we're going to start discussing then the articles. So what were your thoughts on these questions then?
I found the article, I think, of course, he's, supporting this idea, but it's very biased instead of look at it objectively.
Yeah.
Right. That's for me is number one. And number two is lots of samples or examples to refer in the article. It's just one individual's view opinion or view. So there is not enough sample data to support. So you can't take people's opinion as a generalized view.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I think one of the points I wasn't quite sure, the abolishing of the slave, that's really have anything to do with the benefits of colonialism. So that's why I'm not quite sure whether that you can really treat this as the benefits. So those are the three things I kind of spotted.
All very relevant. And what do you think of Rodriguez's critique of that article?
I think that's one way of looking at. I think yes, perspective is very important. For me, I think from a research point of view, you need to actually gather multiple aspects of a problem. right? So I guess that's one way, yeah, look at it.
Mm-hmm. And what else about the whole peer review process and the kind of responses? I don't know if you got to read them, responses to Gilly's article. What does this reveal about the state of knowledge and kind of how we need to look at everything with a critical eye?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure. Yeah, it sounds like they said they actually didn't pass the peer review. Somehow they still published this, right? So it sounds like they don't have a rigid process to control that.
Yeah, I mean, it was controversial because, well, there are various theories, but some people think the editor passed the whole thing to get some incentives of some form, or extra likes and clicks and impact factor.
Okay.
So yeah, eventually this article was actually taken down, but that was after it was published online, and there was like a massive uproar, and there was a link in the original document that was sent out for this workshop about all the responses to it, and there was a public letter, and actually this Gilly guy received death threats and all of this thing, so it was really, really big furore because like this topic is very controversial. But yeah, it was published online before anyone actually really said, oh my god, like, you know, what are the limits of knowledge here? So it just shows things can slip through the net for various reasons. Yeah, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this one, because I'm going to share kind of an example of just like what my thoughts were on this, but it's an example of how to write critical notes as well. Do you have anything else you want to say about this one?
Yeah, so I don't know, because this is basically his view, right? But I don't know whether, I think it's no problem to express his view, but it's just if you're using it as a research article, might be, yeah. Because I just felt if it's a research, then you need to look at all sides. So it's a bit biased.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bit too biased to classify as a view, but you can write it in your blog, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, which is where the importance of critical thinking skills comes in, because you can read all sorts of things online, which is why peer review is supposed to help in the whole process, but sometimes, yeah, it doesn't, or things get through. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It was just the kind of blindsided one perspective sort of approach. I think that was the main issue with it. I'm going to share my critical notes that I wrote, just so you have a kind of example of what I was talking about when I said critical notes. So hopefully you can see that. Basically, so I kind of wrote a brief critique. So of Gilly, Rodriguez, their claims, and the issues with the journal, which you can have a look at here. So I guess some points I wrote down when I was thinking about this was it does not critique the very foundations of colonialism. So you mean the actual impact on populations. So it's basically legitimizing a system that many would argue is inherently wrong at its very roots. He kind of puts forward this idea that people of colonized countries can't self-govern, but doesn't consider actually what colonialism does to people. So I worked in East Timor before, for example, on a research project, and basically they've had such a history of just colonization, decimation, dictatorship, 9 days of independence in between these like Portuguese domination and Indonesian occupation. And it's like, how on earth are these people meant to self-govern? Why would you expect that if this system has done this to them? You know, that's just one example of a kind of very blindsidedness he does not seem to see in this. Another thing is the very limited perspective that we're talking about. He's only focusing on the 19th and 20th centuries. He ignores the decimation of indigenous populations, for instance, in many parts of the world, like Latin America, when Spanish and Portuguese colonizers went over and brought diseases with them, completely decimated a whole knowledge system. Doesn't consider any of those deep roots. They'd be my kind of main contentions with that, the kind of one one-sided perspective thing being the main thing. Rodriguez, the main thing was that this should have been called a case for European or Western colonialism, because it's very Eurocentric when we look at it.
Yeah.
The supposed superiority of Europe and the West, which of course needs to be challenged. And this is sort of what we touched on. It's not so much that he attempted to critique, colonialism. It's that he put forward a certain perspective and lens. So that's what we were just talking about, without full critical analysis of the claims. There are other broader things he could have considered, which are kind of alluded to in the Rodriguez, like rise of capitalism, neoliberalism, those systems and what they do in terms of larger disparities between rich and poor, for instance, does not take into account indigenous knowledge systems, and the ecological implosion of Europe and the West. Seems to think the West is a great place. Yeah, should look around and maybe be a bit more critical of that. Yeah, so issues with the journal then, content and editorial process, obviously. Did it even go through a peer review, or was it about getting more clicks and improving the impact factor of the journal, which is always a consideration. Editor may have chosen to publish it. It's a bit doubtful. I don't know for sure, but even after the review board rejected it, so there's kind of a lack of transparency there. And there is a core question, I know it's not so much wrong that he tried to critique, anti-colonialism, but should there ever be a debate about contentious topics like colonialism, which one could say are in themselves fundamentally wrong? What are the limits of knowledge? That would be kind of my final question. They're my short notes. Like, that's sort of what I'm thinking about in terms of critical notes when you're writing. And you can do that with all sorts of texts you're reading for your thesis or whatever.
I see.
Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yep. Thanks. Yeah. Well, if that's working, the current headline, the Russia invasion of Ukraine wouldn't become the world, hot topic right now.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's a good example, actually, you just mentioned.
I just hope we not trigger us, third world war.
Oh God, yeah, there have been a few threats like that in my lifetime. I was like, after 9/11, I felt like it was going to be the same thing at the time. I thought, oh my God, this could be another war. And then there were wars, but it wasn't like a world thing. So I don't know. It's a tough one.
Yeah, particularly we are so close.
Where are you? You're in what country?
No, I'm in UK as well, though.
Oh, okay, you're in UK. Yeah, we are close,
yeah, we are very close, right? So that's why, if anything started, yeah,
for sure. Yeah, things to think about. Okay, so that was an exercise that hopefully was useful. Where are we with this? I'll go back to this slide then. So after going through all of that and can apply that sort of thinking to whatever you're working on, it can be really useful.
Sure.
I have a few extra slides here that I'll just go through, which is a bit more about the need to be very critical about everything you read. So the interests of the journal's editors and reviewers is one thing you need to consider. Are there any financial incentives involved? Just because a journal has managed to get past peer review or an journal article, it does not mean it's necessarily a trustworthy source. That stands to reason. Always critique what we read. That is a core message. So for instance, these are some examples I've included here. So 3 scholars in the US who wrote 20 fake papers using jargon. You can have a look at that link if you want. Bogus scientific abstracts generated using software programs. Another key example, and I think on the next slide, I actually have included, which you can read for yourself, an example of this automatically generated abstract that was sent into a conference that was actually accepted. And when you read it, just reads like complete jargon. Kernels, which we call curd.
Yeah.
Oh dear. But that sort of stuff happens all the time. It just sounds all fancy, and then you're like IPv4 and gigabit switches, and then it's like, oh, look at that. It's like, what is this? So yeah, that thing happens relatively often, unfortunately. Key take-home message: regardless of whether a piece of literature has gone through a rigorous peer review, always critique its knowledge claims, because ultimately no piece of knowledge is really absolutely true. Regardless of the level of critique that's gone into it, you can always critique it even more.
Sure.
Here are all the references that I mentioned in this. There's even the open letter to Third World Quarterly, which you can look at more of the responses and critiques other scholars and people wrote about this particular example. It's quite comical, some of them, if you read. Yeah, and you can look through some of those, fake articles, just if you want a bit of a laugh also.
Sure.
Thank you very much for this. Hope it's been useful. Have you got any last questions before we wrap up?
No, thank you very much. That's really good. Particularly, I think with a small audience, it's a great opportunity. I really appreciate this.
No problem at all. I'm glad it's useful, and yeah, I'm happy to stay in touch if you have any questions about critical thinking writing. I'll try my best to answer. And I think this presentation goes up on the forum as well if you want to look back at any parts of it. So
sure.
Yeah.
All right. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Take care.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Bye.